Welcome, everyone. Happy Election Day to everyone. My name is Karen Edwards, and I'm the director of the Community University Partnership for the Study of Children, Youth, and Families at in the School of Public Health at the University of Alberta. And I want to welcome you to our last set of talks in the CUPS Issue and Impact series. So if today's talk's your first talk, welcome. And if you've been with us for a long time, welcome back. Please know that, as you can see from the recording button, we are recording the talks, and those talks will all be available on the School of Public Health's YouTube channel, which tonight we'll put in the chat box to that link. So if you want to see any of the other talks, you can. I want to start our time together today by recognizing and speaking to the land we are meeting on. There are likely participants on our call from various geographical locations that reach across the traditional territories of many Indigenous nations. Honoring the land we are on and the footsteps that have walked these lands before us grounds us and acknowledges the importance of relationship. I want to acknowledge the land on which I am standing and the wisdom and footsteps that have marked it for generations, and I encourage you to do the same. The place where I live and join you from today is acknowledged to be the territory covered by Treaty 6 and Region 4 of the Métis Nation of Alberta, a traditional meeting ground, gathering place, and traveling route for many Indigenous peoples for centuries. And by acknowledging this territory, I respect the histories, languages, and cultures of First Nation, Métis, Inuit, and all First Peoples of Canada that enrich my vibrant community. A treaty is an inheritance, a responsibility, and a relationship. We are all treaty people, beneficiaries of the peace and prosperity the treaty brought, and committed also to working toward the equity and justice the treaty promised. May recognizing our status as treaty people help us to be good neighbors to one another, good stewards of the land, and good ancestors to all our children. I want to share a few technical aspects for our session today. We've disabled everyone's microphones and cameras except for the speakers to avoid any technical issues. If we're disrupted in any way during our session, please know that we have a support team in the background with a process in place to promptly deal with any issues, so hold tight if we have any unexpected interruptions. All the questions from our speakers can be shared in the chat box at any time throughout the session, and then I will pose the questions directly to our speaker. And finally, as good reflective thinkers, we need your feedback to help improve events like this. And tonight we'll put the link to the evaluation into the chat box now. And I encourage you to pull it up now so that you don't lose that link before we sign off. For those of you who aren't aware, CUP's a research center in the School of Public Health at the University of Alberta that is co-owned by our community partners. And for the past 20 years, CUP has worked closely with community organizations, researchers, practitioners, funders, and policymakers in Edmonton and across Alberta to identify issues of concern to the well-being of children, youth, and families. And in response to those issues, we collaboratively create research and evaluation projects, generate evidence, and mobilize that evidence into practice programs and policies. This Issues and Impact series was created last year as a celebration of our 20th anniversary. And this series generates discussion around issues relevant to our current research partnerships. So each segment of the series engages field experts like today and CUP's local research partnerships, like our October the 4th discussion. In December, we focused on community-based participatory research. In February, we focused on early learning and care. In May, we talked about transformational evaluation and capacity building. And now our last set of talks will focus on poverty. As the complex impacts of COVID continue to reveal themselves for families, the sector, and our city, addressing the emerging issues will require good evidence, cross-sector services, and the input of multiple layers of government. And that's why I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. McCormick to share his experiences with the Poverty Reduction Initiative, very similar in many respects to our own here in Edmonton. Jim McCormick is the Chief Executive of the Robertson Trust in the UK. Previously, he was Associate Director Scotland with the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, ran an independent research consultancy, and was director of the Scottish Council Foundation think tank. He is chair of the Independent Disability and Carers Benefit Advisory Group, reporting to the Cabinet Secretary for Social Security, and a member of the Scottish Government's Social Renewal Advisory Board. He was chair of the Edinburgh Poverty Commission from 2018 to 2020, and a member of the Social Security Advisory Committee, which scrutinizes the Department for Work and Pensions Great Britain regulations. In 2018, he was a traveling Churchill Fellow, looking at the impact of mentoring programs for children and young people facing disadvantage in the USA, in Canada, and New Zealand. And his interests include music, languages, and of course, Greenock Morton's Football Club. I want to welcome Jim today, and I'll ask Shelley to share his PowerPoint, please.
Thank you very much indeed, Karen, and to all of your colleagues at CUP. It is a great pleasure to join you on your election day, which we didn't know was going to happen when this date was first chosen. It's almost exactly 3 years since I had the pleasure of being in Edmonton and Calgary as part of the research trip that Karen just mentioned, and it's a genuine pleasure to continue the connection with Edmonton and with Alberta. And I was telling Karen and our colleagues last week that when I left Edmonton and got back to Scotland, an invitation to chair the Edinburgh Poverty Commission was waiting for me, and having seen End Poverty Edmonton, having seen its approach, its impact, and taking inspiration from what could be done at the city level in a governance system with federal and provincial, not unlike UK and Scottish government tiers before you get to city level. I thought there's so much we could learn from our respective jurisdictions. So I wanted to share some thoughts about the commission process that we followed in Edinburgh and address this question: if we were to end poverty at the city level, what will it take? So go on to the first slide, please, Shelley. Thank you. I think it's appropriate on a day when, like it or not, political matters are on our minds, to set this in context. So before we zoom into the city level, to think about the forces that lie beyond municipalities and their scope for action. And just to tell you a little about the context in Scotland, in 1999, Scotland voted by a large majority to establish again a parliament in Edinburgh, almost 300 years after the Act of Union with England, and ushered in a new era of devolution that also sees Northern Ireland and Wales having its own devolved jurisdictions. Each nation of the UK has different degrees of devolution. We are not a federal country like Canada. It's very uneven, and even taking into account Quebec within Canada, powers in Scotland are less advanced after 2 decades of devolution than would be true in your case. Nonetheless, you can see here a picture of our Parliament building in Edinburgh. You'll see 3 flags, UK, Scotland and Europe. And I wanted just to say a bit about our constitutional backdrop as well. Almost exactly 7 years ago, we had, you may remember, an independence referendum on the question of whether Scotland should remain, should become a separate independent country or stay within the United Kingdom. Scotland voted by a margin of 55 to 45 to stay in the UK, and more powers came shortly after that to Scotland as part of, if you like, the deal for remaining in the UK. 2 years later, so 5 years ago, the whole of the UK voted on whether to remain as a member of the European Union. That was a closer referendum result. Again, it was 52 to 48 in favour of leaving the European Union, but some of the tensions and even fractures in our politics became very clear because Scotland and London, for that matter, along with Northern Ireland, were the parts of the UK which voted decisively to stay in the European Union. So that triggered another round of soul searching, really, and political debate about identity at different levels. Those dynamics have far from been resolved. Nonetheless, politics as usual continues, and back in May, we had our latest election to the Parliament in Edinburgh. That resulted, despite all the upheaval I've mentioned, that resulted in hardly any change, actually, in the makeup of our Parliament. You can see from this graphic where you can see the leaders of the three main parties, including in the middle, First Minister Nicola Sturgeon, who leads the Scottish National Party. That's the party which favours Scotland leaving the United Kingdom. And although the referendum was lost, her party has been exceptionally successful in the last number of elections. They have been in power now for 14 years. Most of that time as a minority government, you can see from the numbers, they fell only one seat short of a majority on this occasion. Scotland uses a form of proportional representation very similar to that used in Germany and in New Zealand. So it's a proportional system. And an interesting development recently is, although they are so close to being in a majority, in order to be sure of passing budget bills and key pieces of legislation, we now have our first formed agreement with the Green Party, and those 8 seats they won has allowed them to have ministers, Green ministers, for the first time in anywhere in the UK, actually. It's not a formal coalition. It's looser than that. It's similar to New Zealand's Labour-Green agreement, and it's very new for us. So we still have to see how that works out, but I hope that gives a flavour of what's happening in terms of our devolved Parliament. So on to the next slide, and to address poverty in the Scottish context. 1 in 5 of the population lives in poverty in Scotland. It's a little lower than the UK rate as a whole, but that goes up to 1 in 4 of children. And we know from decades of research, we know from analysis, we know from lived experience involvement, that some of the key drivers of modern day poverty, paid work, not just about hourly wages being inadequate. We have a thriving living wage movement in Scotland, but even that's not enough if you can't secure enough working hours, or they're very unpredictable. We measured poverty after housing costs, and therefore high rents tip households into poverty. And that's avoidable if we fixed our housing system, and that's especially true, as I'll come on to say a little later, in Edinburgh. Social security, an interesting divergence in language has occurred. So Scotland is building its own partial system of social security in recent years. We don't talk about welfare in the same way as the UK does. That's become somewhat of a tarnished currency over recent years. But what happens at the UK level in terms of social security still has a very, very big bearing in Scotland and the whole of the UK. And I'll come on to say a word about universal credit and that a change in that system that's coming at the end of this month that's very significant. Cost of living, we heard only today that the inflation rate is rising fast. There is a poverty premium that sees lower income households pay more for the essentials, and those essentials like food and fuel and rent and travel make up a bigger share of household budgets. And we heard today that energy prices, the cap on energy prices is going up by 13% next month for households who are on prepayment meters and have least flexibility in their costs. And poverty is not just about the here and now, it's also about prospects and life chances. And we know that there are still childcare constraints, although our system is well advanced compared to a generation ago. We know that the attainment gap opens up early and it increases. We've been committing ourselves in Scotland to a lot of focused work around trying to reverse that trend, and there was some evidence before the pandemic it was having gradual success. We also know, here's a stark finding, that it's one thing to be in low paid work, it's quite another to be trapped there without an escape route. And before the pandemic, measured across a whole decade, your odds of fully escaping low paid work in Scotland were only 1 in 5. So we have a problem about economic mobility, not just poverty in the here and now. So on the next slide, thank you. I just wanted to show this graphic because Scotland is currently the only part of the UK which still has statutory duty in law to take action to significantly reduce child poverty. That was true of the UK until a decade ago. Scotland is now the only part where that's true. In a hopeful sense, all of our political parties, from right to left in the Scottish Parliament, signed up to this legislation, so all are accountable for its success. And that means that within 3 years, we should see child poverty moving down below 1 in 5 to 18%, and by the end of this decade to 10%. Now, it's easy to set targets. We are in fact being blown off course even before the pandemic against these targets, but at least this gives an accountability focus, and it means there's now a very sharp challenge to devolve government and local government to do all they can within the restrictions of what's happening to our public finances to take action quickly to ensure costs for households are falling where possible, incomes are being maximised, and we are, as we build out from the pandemic, focusing on fair work rather than any job. So on the next slide, I want to say a word about the housing story because it's really significant in Scotland. This tells the story of housing before and after housing costs for Scotland and the rest of the UK. The two lower lines on this graph, which I think are red and purple, but I'm colourblind, so forgive me. These are Scotland and the UK before housing costs over 2 decades, and you can see that these lines come to converge, and that means before we look at housing costs, there isn't much of a difference in the overall poverty rate in Scotland and the UK. After housing costs, poverty jumps up, but it jumps up by less in Scotland than the UK as a whole. And if I showed you the numbers for only families with children, the gap is even greater, which is to say that housing acts as a protection against an increase in poverty more than anywhere else in the UK. And that's because of our housing tenure. We have more social housing still in Scotland, not enough to tackle various market failures, but we have more. And our rents on average are 20% cheaper than in England. And those give us significant inbuilt advantage when it comes to at least holding down the rise in poverty that is being seen elsewhere in the UK. And on the next slide, the social security story. So universal credit is an all-in reform that brings together 6 income-related benefits for people of working age. It's been around for almost a decade now at the UK level. And at the start of the pandemic, we saw not just a very big increase in the number of families claiming universal credit, but also a commitment of a £20 a week uplift for all households claiming it's a flat rate increase. Yeah. That has done something to protect families and to reduce the shock of the pandemic. It didn't apply to so-called legacy payments, so many disabled people and carers did not benefit from that increase, but nonetheless that uplift has been in place for almost 18 months. Now, at the end of this month, as I mentioned earlier, the Westminster government is planning to remove that uplift, and that will mean, as you can see here, a large proportion of households between 20% and over 35%, depending on where you are, of households will see overnight a cut of £1,000 a year. Now, I haven't looked at the exchange rate today, but that is a very significant sum of money for any household to lose overnight. Biggest cut in working age Social Security since the Second World War. There's still time for this not to happen, but as things stand, the lowest income households in our society will see that cut at the same time as energy prices are about to jump, and there's also a new increase in social insurance, a new tax to help pay for reforms to social care coming before long. So it is a squeeze on living standards for low-income households, which is pretty unprecedented. I'm going to pick up the pace with the next few slides. Now, here is where we introduce the voices of people to speak for themselves. And this is a short film clip, which comes from people we worked with in Edinburgh, who told us in their own words, for them, what poverty is. And there's a couple of film clips, and then we'll come on to say more about what's happening at the city level.
Edinburgh Poverty Commission.
I'm Sarah. I'm a lone parent that lives in Edinburgh. I'm also a full-time student.
I'm Linda Craig, and I am a full-time carer for an adult member of my family.
My name is Iska Ngonomo. I'm a single mum.
Hi, I'm Paul Stewart. I live in a tower block myself. I was homeless a couple of years ago, and I'm at risk of becoming homeless again.
Is poverty a problem in Edinburgh?
I'm living in poverty, and I see it every day.
I think it's a hidden problem. People are not aware of it, usually probably like myself, until they experience it. Nobody speaks about it publicly, they assume that it's only homeless people or unemployed people who experience poverty, whereas that's simply not the case.
I live in an area where it's quite prominent, so also that not just prominent, but it's an area where there's a lot of ethnic minority groups.
What makes it difficult for people to get out of poverty?
I think really for anybody, if you don't have a strong support network, big issue for you there.
It's not just about knowing, even if they know, they can't have access to that. And the other thing is people are scared to talk. Child care, for instance. That's another one that is keeping most Africans in poverty, because as you know, most Africans are nurses, carers. So, and those jobs don't finish until 10 p.m., 11 p.m. or that sort of thing. There's no childcare provider for those times.
How does poverty affect people's lives and well-being?
Poverty affects people's lives and well-being in so many different ways, from accessing healthcare to living in safe and affordable housing. I know this myself through lived experience, that in order to get on the housing ladder is just No, it just doesn't happen nowadays for young people.
I only get £68 per week on benefits, and it doesn't cover my whole rent. So I'm already in rent arrears, and so I'm already at risk of becoming homeless again after a 2-year period.
When you experience poverty, you try and hide it. You don't know where to go for help. Your standard of living drops dramatically, and obviously that has an impact on your confidence, your self-esteem, even your respect for yourself.
Thanks, Shelley. Let's play the next one back to back, please.
Edinburgh Poverty Commission. What needs to change to end poverty?
I think they could look into more how the situation of Black people is, but that cannot be done without a Black person being involved. No matter what, if it's a person trying to give me food who has never felt hungry the way I feel hungry, the solution will never be adequate.
Everybody wants to contribute in some way, you know, myself included, but I am barred from doing so many things because if I go to work, I lose certain benefits, and I worked out, you know, I found an employer who could work with the hours I was available, and I would have been £8 a week better off for working 23 hours a week. It's just not physically possible to do it. So I'm stuck in that cycle of not being able to work. I've always worked. You know, I should be working for at least another 10 years, and it's not going to happen unless someone can help me get out of this cycle.
Because, as I said earlier, we're living in a low-wage economy, high cost of living. There's something not right. Something's got to give at some point, you know, so we need to increase the wages. I would like to see as well more community crofts in Edinburgh. We've got a community croft here in Leith, for example, and you can get given a bit of land and you can go and work in it and grow some food and stuff like that. They also sell their produce pretty cheaply.
What can ordinary citizens do to help end poverty in Edinburgh?
You help each other. You give out to other people. If you have, give out to others. That's more the community can do.
Honestly, going back into education is the best thing I've ever done. I'm on my dream career path that I know is going to provide a decent future for myself and my daughter in the long run. So definitely, you know, definitely think about it, because there's a lot of people that could benefit from actually being back in education.
All I want to do is work and contribute towards society, and I don't care if it's volunteering, clearing the streets, whatever. I don't care. I want to do something to make me feel useful again. And then I think there's a lot of citizens out there who, if they were aware of the scale of the problem, would welcome people coming to help them.
So if the people can get together and to try and put pressure onto the politicians through citizen groups, through work like what the Poverty Commission are doing, I think that will probably try and help to alleviate poverty. The people in authority, they need to take on board what this report is saying to them. Come and meet us, but please just act upon it. Take on board the recommendations from the Commission and act upon it.
Thanks, Shelley. Let's go to the next slide and just say a bit more about the work we did together in Edinburgh. I should say that the voices you heard in those film clips, those are among the people who have formed a citizen network called End Poverty Edinburgh, and we passed the baton to them when we reported a year ago, and that's a group of citizens who are there to hold our report up to the light, but also hold the city's decision makers to account for the decisions they make and don't make. So an important part of trying to shift the power balance and widen the platform around voice. On the next couple of slides, just to conclude, here's how we have framed our call to action in Edinburgh. And you can see these building blocks are no doubt very familiar. They are about fair work, connectivity, transit, income security, a decent home we can afford, and so on. I want to just say a word about what's in that gold, I think, hexagon in the middle of the slide, on the next slide, if that's okay, Shelley. Thank you. Whether it is education or work or housing, all these burning priorities, we wanted to put at the heart of what we do a culture shift, which we talk about as a relationship-based approach to how we operate. And if there's one thing to take away from this slide, it is the more than 1,000 conversations we had with people over 18 months told us time after time that people who are living in poverty or close to it are exhausted by the process. It's stigmatizing, it's expensive, it's frustrating, it's time consuming. People talked about feeling that they are shunted from pillar to post, being assessed and referred and handed over between multiple services, and we have to stop doing that. And at the heart of what we envisage for Edinburgh and beyond is a model where wherever you access support digitally or face-to-face, we should have a single gateway, no matter how messy our services are behind that gateway, where you can be confident that someone will help to work with you at your own pace across a number of areas where you might need support, family-based support, education, debt, avoiding eviction, whatever it happens to be, without having to crisscross the city time after time to access separate support. And then on the next slide, thank you. I just want to pick out a couple of points from this because this gets to the heart of what can be done at the city level. And we called our report a just capital because Edinburgh is Scotland's capital city. And to pick out a couple of things here, there is no route to ending poverty in a place like Edinburgh without addressing the housing crisis. We think that crisis is about inadequate supply of affordable housing. Edinburgh, that's partly in the city, it's about the private rented sector, it's partly about the cost of rents. A huge number of properties are Airbnb properties, and there's an attempt now to regulate and license differently. But a new funding settlement is needed with Scottish Government. We need to boost the supply of affordable social rented housing every single year this decade and do much more to prevent homelessness. I would also pick out on the Fair Work slide the coming movement around living hours. So yes, living wage, but Edinburgh has actually the highest number of the workforce covered by living wage already. The real challenge is around adequate, predictable working hours, and there's a living hours campaign now taking off to try and achieve that. One final point I would pick out is the Maximise programme, and that is if you go to your doctor or school or childcare provider or housing office, being able to get support confidentially across a raft of income maximisation and debt reduction supports. It's a really effective and efficient programme, and that's now being scaled up across the whole city. It's not a new idea, but it's an exciting model that can really help transform people's incomes quickly to make sure people receive all the support they are entitled to. I'm going to pause there. I've spoken for too long, but I really do appreciate you listening to the story from this side of the Atlantic, and I'm looking forward to hearing your questions and comments. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Jim. The similarities are not surprising, sadly. And and very interesting for our community to pose questions to you about what is happening in different respects to the circumstances that you just articulated, as you said, across the pond. So my job, my honor, is to be able to facilitate the discussion as we move forward. So the first question that I have for you, what do you consider the colluding factors that brought about the £1,000 per year reduction?
Thanks. I've just done a quick calculation. It is $17.50 in Canadian dollars, today's prices, overnight reduction, just to give you a sense of it. So we have a majority Conservative government that introduced universal credit as a reform. It's here to stay. I think it has decided that next week it will also remove the furlough protections in the job market. And to be fair, we have seen a very significant increase in hiring again, and the employment rate has bounced back. However, a lot of the employment that's being created, as it was before the pandemic, is in lower waged sectors. And in any way, there is not a straight translation between people who lost their jobs and those who get the new jobs. So the economic rationale for removing the Social Security safety net, the uplift, is really questionable even on economic grounds. But I think the government in London is choosing to do it because they believe that a welfare extension is the wrong thing at this time. What they've forgotten is universal credit is an in and out of work benefit. It was designed to allow people to cope with those transitions, and easily half of the people who will be hit by this cut in 10 days' time are working households. So on many grounds, it doesn't stack up. The final point to make, I think, is there's still hope, because there's a strong alliance, including members of the governing party, including 5 former ministers, who are saying this should not happen, and some of them are now threatening to derail other legislation if the cut does go ahead. So there is still time and still hope.
Interesting. The next question I have, you've mentioned fair work. How much is the business community partners in poverty? Is it quite commonplace, or is it considered not their problem?
That's a really good question, because we know, given how prevalent in-work poverty is these days, that even every government job and even every government procured job, if it were living wage, would not end this difficulty. So employers in all sectors have to be part of the solution. I think we've made some progress in Scotland. We have an accreditation initiative, which is driving take-up of living wage in key sectors. So in terms of living wage, we're making progress, I would say. However, the problem of in-work poverty can be explained, or a large chunk of it can be explained by only 4 or 5 economic sectors, and they're the ones you'd expect in care and retail and hospitality and tourism, food and drink. There's a lot more to do to go beyond living wage take-up to address the problem of who gets access to high quality training, to spring that trap, and to stabilise working hours. The living hours standard is only between 16 and 20 hours a week for those who are seeking that level of employment. So it's quite a modest benchmark. That's the next big movement, I would say. And we don't know enough now or yet about what shape employers are going to emerge from the pandemic in. but we absolutely need to accelerate the business case, if you like, the economic case for entrenching fair work and not repeating the mistakes of the last 2 decades.
Thank you for that response. The next question, can you talk a little bit more about the steering committee and how people living in poverty are engaged in your work?
Yes. So the commission that I was part of, and I see one of my fellow commissioners has joined this meeting. His name is Stephen Kelly. He is a head teacher in Edinburgh and doing fantastic work around the school contribution to what we're talking about. But the commission, to be very honest with you, the commission began as quite a traditional group of people. We did have 3 people who self-identified as having had or currently first-hand experience, but that's 3 out of 12. It's not equal. So our condition for joining the commission was that we would walk hand in hand with a group of citizens who are now in place and let them develop at their own pace in Poverty Edinburgh. And our commitment was also to have those 1,000 conversations with people. Not everyone wants to join a commission or a group, but many people are happy to talk about their experiences if they think they're going to be listened to, and if practical ideas flow from the endeavour. There must have been 30 or 40 similar commissions across the UK in the last decade. I genuinely believe that what we did in Edinburgh broke some new ground. It was partly because of the breadth and depth of the inquiry, but also because, to be fair to the politicians, every group of elected members in the municipality committed along the journey to not play games with this agenda, to not deny poverty is real. Edinburgh is a wealthy city, but it has a real problem of poverty. Everyone knows it. So when we came to launch a year ago, that was banked in a way, and we could get on to talking about which actions, not whether we take action. So, and a year on from that, it is the voices of people, credible voices, interested in solutions, that I think continues to keep that flame burning, if you like, long after the commission ended its work.
Sounds, again, very, very similar experiences and things we've been moving towards here in Edmonton. The next question I have is about one of the comments that came from the video. So one of the folks in the video mentioned childcare. Is childcare part of the plan for ending poverty in Edinburgh? And if so, what specific actions are being taken at the city level to address childcare?
In Scotland, we, and the UK as a whole, we have been somewhere between a North American and Southern European model with which has a very limited public offer historically around subsidised childcare, but wanting to be more like Scandinavia in time. So we're kind of on that journey, but we've a long way to go. It means that delayed by the pandemic, but there is a commitment to substantially increase the number of free childcare hours for 3 and 4-year-olds, part of the week, not the whole of the week, not wraparound care, and a targeted offer currently for low-income families with 2-year-olds. That is a doubling of what we had previously, but it will not address the point that ISCA and others have raised around shift patterns, and what we used to call atypical working hours, but have become very typical for many people. So I think there's not a solution just through childcare to those kind of working hours. I think we need to get much better at enabling parents, in particular single parents, to be able to find work that fits with their family lives. And that might be term time working hours, so that they can take school holidays off, or at least work part-time. I don't think it's sustainable to think of a childcare model that is 24 hours. I think that's not good for children's development or family balance, but I think we could do more to really ramp up family-friendly working in ways that some of our near neighbours in Europe have got closer to than we currently have.
And in Edmonton, as part of End Poverty Edmonton, we also do have the Edmonton Council for Early Learning and Care, which is tackling a lot of those issues municipally, provincially, and even federally. The next question that I have is, when you talk about a single point of contact for services, avoiding people shuffling between multiple services, how does that work with different levels of government? Are you able to collaborate with governments beyond the municipal level?
Not yet is the answer, or not comprehensively. So if I paint you a picture of, I talked about the Maximise programme in Edinburgh, where you could, as a parent, be engaging with the school or going along to your GP surgery, doctor surgery. Now, what you see in those settings are money and welfare advisors who can do a great deal to try and join up different levels of government. So they can advise you on city, Scottish and UK payments in one go. But we still have, for example, a job centre network, which is UK run. It's still possible that you could find your payments paused or stopped, depending on conditionality rules. And it's very hard for one single gateway to solve some of those hard edges in our systems. So we've made a lot of progress to reduce the degree of hassle that people experience. But there's a long way to go for, in particular, I would say, UK and Scottish governments to cooperate around data sharing. Our new devolved agency for Social Security, it covers the key disability benefits, but it doesn't cover all other payments. So there's still, if you're a citizen, you could be standing at a crossroads facing in 4 directions in terms of where you could get income protection from. And if the politicians can't fix it, we have to do the best job we can at city level to make that less bumpy a journey for ordinary folks.
A similar kind of question had come to mind when I was listening to your talk, and I was wondering about how the not-for-profit sector, our social sort of service support sector, is involved in the work here in Edmonton. Are they involved in the advocacy that's happening within your program, within your initiative?
Yes, in fact, they lead it, and an interesting thing happened during the pandemic. We extended our work by 6 months. We weren't ready to conclude, and we produced some interim findings that told the story of the first 6 to 8 weeks of the pandemic. And what we saw very quickly was a bit of a resetting happening between the municipality and the not-for-profit sector, because there was no choice. The city authority knew it had to step back and create more space for faith-based groups, volunteer groups, food projects, and so on to step in and quickly respond to people who were not on the radar previously for the city authorities. We now need to not go back the way. We now need statutory sector agencies to rethink their commissioning models and grow the space for not-for-profits, not shrink it, in a more respectful partnership. And historically, Edinburgh would not have been one of the places, I think, that was creating enough space, but there is an opportunity now for that to happen. And we certainly have a very emboldened not-for-profit sector that will not easily go back into its box, I would say. Not that it was in a box, but it doesn't want to go back to where it was.
Fair enough. This one is about social procurement. There's a couple here. So Scotland is known as a leader in social procurement. Does social procurement fit within your strategies? And if so, how?
I think that is a really good question. What we tried to do, well, there's two levels to this. One of the very, very, very few opportunities created by leaving the European Union, and being very careful in my wording here, is the possibility of pursuing a different path on public procurement and how public finances can be invested. Some European rules which were about levelling up and a level playing field won't apply in the same way. And who knows, that may not be an opportunity, but it's a possibility. Nonetheless, even without that, there's a great deal more we can do within our annual public budgets. And at a city level, as well as at Scotland level, there's a real move now to put greater conditionality into our business grants. There are huge amounts of money that flow through different providers of services out with the public sector. One of those conditions should be about the number of new jobs and training opportunities at living wage that are created. And we can do that with our health service and our local authority, which are among the biggest employers. And we can do more to actually level the playing field with our not-for-profit sector, who are often providing a lot of our particularly adult and disability care, but not able always to pay the same rate for the job because the contract value is lower than it would be with an in-house option. So it's a very live question, and we have a lot of work to do to accelerate that movement. We're not yet where we should be in terms of maximising the value of existing public budgets.
I know there's a lot of initiatives within our End Poverty Edmonton, which do touch on social procurement. So it seems like there might be space to stay connected on those types of things. I should have asked this one earlier when we were talking about the involvement of lived experience, but someone was actually looking for, is there an example that you can provide of how that lived experience group is holding the government to account?
It's a really good question. So the first week of October in Scotland is called Challenge Poverty Week. And that's when we start to see every local authority and health authority, by statutory duty, has to give an annual report on the steps it has taken to reduce child poverty in particular. And so we will start to see in Edinburgh its annual report, but we already know that the citizen network that has developed is making some very powerful statements about procurement. it's talking about the importance of extending those kind of single gateways. And it's doing quite a lot around homelessness. We saw, as I'm sure you did, a remarkable response to the pandemic around rough sleeping to bring people in from being on the streets. People went into hotels, some men went on to settled accommodation, but what we see from citizens in Edinburgh is a real determination to not go back the way. And given what I said about the housing crisis, the kind of design thinking that's coming from citizens around housing and homelessness services, transforming the quality of service people experience, taking away the kind of the bidding that goes on. People have to bid every week on properties to stay in the system. It's confusing. People find it demoralizing. There's a lot of citizen design thinking that will go into improving our housing and homelessness services. So we are only in the foothills of what has to be done, but the relationships are now established and an expectation has been set around continuing to improve the city's response.
Thank you for that. I think we probably have time for one more, and this might not be the smallest question to end on. So the comment in question is this: I think that the effect of climate change on poverty is often far removed from public and political discourse. Yet upcoming research and reports have noted that migration due to climate change will continue to increase, especially towards countries closer to the north. What are your thoughts on the potential implications of climate uncertainty on poverty, especially with regards to intensifying prevailing issues in areas like housing affordability, job availability, and racial inequality?
So thank you for that huge question to end on. I would say a couple of things, I guess, without being an expert in this area. So in Edinburgh, the city also established an independent climate commission, and it's really interesting how the twin challenges of ending poverty and net zero, a low carbon future, have been brought together. I think it's in a unique way actually within Scotland, happening within Edinburgh. And there's a lot to do around decarbonising housing and transit in particular. We've done a very good job actually on power supply to homes and businesses, but not on transit. So there is a really stretching commitment in Scotland. The legislation goes beyond what we see at the UK level around carbon reduction. COP26 is coming to the city I'm in tonight, Glasgow, in November. So there's a particular moment here in our thinking, in our politics to build on. We already see the impact of the Afghanistan crisis, and the first families arrived in Edinburgh 2 weeks ago. But that's one wave following many waves in terms of refugee arrivals. I think our systems have a long way to go. I hope and believe that Scotland is a modestly more welcoming context than we see maybe in other areas not far from us. But there is, on the other hand, there's absolutely no doubt that we have a long way to go to recognise the scale of the challenge, to do more than mitigate, what's coming our way, and to fully take on the challenge of racial injustice. We see progress in our schools, we see progress in our policies, but we have a great deal of distance to travel around fully adjusting in a proactive way to the challenges that you've just asked me about. And I hope to see a much closer fusion of poverty reduction and carbon reduction in the years ahead.
Well, I want to thank you so much, Jim, for being with us today. Thank the internet technology for holding us together across the pond, and for your time, because I know it's later where you are than where we are. Thank you so much for such a fantastic conversation. I want to remind everybody tonight to put the link to the feedback survey in the chat box. Remind you of the last, I cannot believe it, but the last Issues and Impacts talk will be on October the 4th, where we're going to hear from Dr. Maria Mayen and the End Poverty Edmonton team. So this side of the pond's perspective on what's happening within a municipality around poverty elimination. And they're going to talk about inclusive economic recovery. So our October 4th talk will also be the School of Public Health's 2021 This is Public Health Talk. So you can register through Eventbrite, through CUP's Eventbrite channel. Thank you everyone for being with us today. We look forward to seeing you one last time on October the 4th, and everybody stay safe and be well. Thank you so much, Dr. McCormick.